thank you for this wonderful life work program, which is obviously really hitting some high points of understanding and articulating and living the Christian life. I've been asked to speak about worldview. Before I do that, I wanted to tell you a rather charming story, which I'm sure is quite apocryphal, about this is an English police inspector who was asked for one day to exchange jobs with a high school teacher. And so he comes into the class he's assigned to teach is what is called in the English school system scripture knowledge. This is something virtually everybody has to do, and it's sort of a routine sort of pro forma thing, and very often the teachers are not Christians at all and they hardly know what they're teaching. So the police inspector comes into the class and he wears a sort of rather stern frown as befitting his position, and he says, "All right, now I have one question for you. Who knocked down the walls of Jericho?" And there's a sort of embarrassed silence, a little bit of tittering among the crowd. And then a small boy at the back raises his hand and said, "Excuse me, sir, my name is Bruce Jones, and I didn't do it." So, and I don't know who did it either. So the police inspector thinks this is a rather cheeky response from a kid. So he goes to the school principal and he says, "I asked a simple question, who knocked down the walls of Jericho? And I had this response from your pupil, Bruce Jones. Can't we do better than that?" And the principal said, "Oh, excuse me, sir, I am sure there's a huge mistake. If you wish to make a claim, we'll write a letter to the Ministry of Education, and they may be able to compensate you for this." So that's what happens when you have police inspectors taking the job of teachers. Sometimes it takes an interesting direction. The thing about worldview is, like bad breath or body odor, an awful lot of people have it without knowing that they have it. And you can infer worldview very often from just a few comments or a few answers to questions that people make. But very few people in the whole of the United States, indeed in the whole world, have a thoroughly thought through Christian worldview. It's very rare to find somebody who can, as Andre was telling us, explain what he or she believes, and similarly articulate the situation of the world in light of those beliefs. Most people have a sort of varied hodgepodge of beliefs. Not very concise, very diverse. Some of these are identifiable with a Christian view, but only partially. And of those people who do have worldview beliefs, most of them have what might be called passive beliefs. They don't actively project their understanding of the world either into their own behavior or into their attitudes towards reality around them. Most people are passive, a few are positive and active, and I'll come to that in a moment. One of the most easily identifiable active and positive, but I don't use that word as a compliment, worldviews is the Islamist worldview. Now, this is distinct from a Muslim worldview. We've probably all met delightful Muslims who do wonderful jobs. Some of them are patriotic, some of them serve in the military or in other aspects of the government. And they don't want to change very much, if anything, about the American society into which they have settled. They are Muslims, they are not Islamists. Islamists is a category of Muslims. There are some, actually quite a lot, already in the United States, but most of them are located in the Middle East or in Pakistan, who have a very specific set of positive or direct, active views on all kinds of things. Basically, they seek an ultimate caliphate, a return to the situation where Islam was a ruling ideology of a particular part of the world. In the case of Muslims, of course, it started in Arabia. But Islamists want Islam to be a totalitarian global ideology. They don't want it to be something you choose or don't choose. They believe the whole of the human race should be ruled under Islamist principles. And the most important of those principles legally is the Islamic code of law, Sharia, which has a number of restrictions and provisions that you've probably all heard quite a bit about at different times. The Islamist worldview is a rather dangerous worldview for a number of reasons, not simply because it's ultimately totalitarian, just as communism was, but also because it has an attitude to ways of thinking which most of us, Christian or secular or agnostic, have taken for granted. For example, most people in most parts of the world accept the validity of the use of reason as a way to making decisions, coming to conclusions about things. But for Islamists, reason is the enemy of Allah. The only ultimate criterion of truth is the revelation of Allah or God in the Quran. Everything that speculates on matters of reality beyond that is not only speculation, but is actually a form of either apostasy or heresy of some kind. Now, this is a very peculiar situation. I need to deal with it just briefly. Islam had a period early in its history when its worldview was actually quite comprehensive and flexible. Around the period about 600 or 700 or 800 AD, there were a group of Muslims who were very open to the writings of the Greek philosophers, very open to the idea of philosophical speculation, of the use of reason as a guide to living a good Muslim life. And as people who thought they could possibly learn something about living the Muslim life from people who were not Muslims. That point of view was shared by a group of people called the Mutazilites. And unfortunately, the Mutazilites were rather dogmatic, and they exerted a serious persecution of people who had the traditional Islamic view and killed many of them, exiled, imprisoned others. So, when there was a backlash against the Mutazilites, a group called the Ash'arites came to power, and one of their leading philosophers was a man called Al-Ghazali, who wrote a book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And essentially what Al-Ghazali did was he said, it is impossible to use reason for any beneficial understanding of the reality of life. The only way you can understand life is to know the Quran, to obey the Quranic precepts, and to hope that Allah, in His inscrutable wisdom, will benefit you in the course of your life. Most of you already know that Islam does not have a doctrine of salvation. There is no way that you can ever be sure that you are good enough for God. You may lead a life which is 52% good and 48% better, and still not get into paradise in the Islamic scheme of things, because God had a bad hair day. It's entirely up to God. There are no theological rules that you can possibly rely upon for salvation within the Islamic scheme of things. However, there is one way that you can guarantee paradise, and that is by dying in jihad. That if you are fighting, defending, or expanding Islam, and you die in that process, you die as a martyr in the Islamic concept of the word. And you become a person who has died in jihad, and that gets you automatically into heaven, into paradise. Now, it's significant how this affects the Islamist view of the behavior and the world, and I'll give you just two examples of this. There were two British Muslims of originally Pakistani background who were arrested in Israel a couple of years ago for plotting a suicide bomb. Fortunately, the plot went awry. They were arrested before they could implement this rather dastardly plan, and they were interrogated by the Israeli intelligence, and then they were actually interviewed by international television crews. And they said something that was very interesting, and I'll tell you why in relation to another quote from an Islamist. They said, and I'll imitate the North Country British accent of this couple, the difference between you and us is that you love life and we love death. That's what they said. Now, you may have recalled the shooting at Fort Hood by Major Malik Hassan. Major Malik Hassan, in one of the presentations to fellow physicians at a military hospital where he was assigned, gave multiple explanations of why Islam was a superior way of life, a superior philosophy and religion to everything else. He said exactly the same thing. The difference between you and us is you love life and we love death. Now that's the Islamist view, and of course it's I think we would all consider it a very extreme view and a rather repulsive view. But it's one of the clearly identifiable worldviews that is articulated positively, or at least articulated actively by certain groups of people, both in the United States and around the world. There are a few other positive worldviews. I won't go into all of them, but you've all heard, of course, of communism or Marxism-Leninism. This is espoused by a handful of people in China, in the Chinese Communist Party, in Cuba, and in Vietnam, and not to forget, of course, by a large number of United States college professors who seem to espouse this particular philosophy of life. Their view is very simple. Capitalism and freedom, the freedom in which capitalism develops, is going to collapse ultimately, and the world will move in the direction of a proletarian revolution in which the Communist Party will emerge from the chaos and direct societies all over the world into a future utopia of socialist collectivism. That's the world Marxist-Leninist view. You still find a few people in these countries I've mentioned believing that, probably more Americans than Chinese these days, but because anybody who's experienced Marxism-Leninism at first hand is exceedingly depressed by the consequences of that kind of rule. There are some neo-Nazis, the third line of thinking. You find neo-Nazis in Europe, in Germany, in Sweden, in other Scandinavian countries. And these are people who basically subscribe to a victim mentality, just as the original Nazis did. The original Nazis who surrounded Adolf Hitler had a beef. Germany had been humiliated, had been deprived of its legitimate rights as a major power. The Treaty of Versailles was grossly unfair, had stripped Germany of its wealth, and Germany had a duty to itself, to its future, and indeed to the world, to recover the legacy which it had lost. The neo-Nazis are people who also claim victimhood. We are Germans, we are Swedes who are being inundated in our own countries by those Muslim immigrants. And so neo-Nazi political activism in Europe is directed very strongly against any further immigration. It has both an anti-Muslim component and an anti-Semitic component, because in the end, virtually anybody who's of foreign or different origin is considered suspect and a threat to the purity of the regime or the national background. Then there's great power nationalist realism. I would say that is the worldview of Russians and Chinese, even if in the China case they happen to be members of the Communist Party. They're basically people who think Russia has a destiny in the world which has probably been suppressed by foreigners. Russians are always writing editorials about being encircled by the Americans. And the Chinese are always saying that America is trying to blockade China and impose limits on China's ability to assume its destiny as a world power. So those are what you might call great power nationalist realists. And then in the US, there's a real mishmash of worldviews, and I want to go through them so you can identify some of your friends who may subscribe to these different varieties of worldview. First, of course, there are Christians in this country who are articulate, have a deep personal faith, live out their Christian lives in a laudatory way, and can explain their worldview, which is that they believe the United States has been called by God for a special purpose, and that the original American settlers came to the United States in order to establish a Christian commonwealth, if you like, which ultimately could be a blessing for the whole world. Now, I'm not saying all of the people who subscribe to this believe every part of it, but the view of America as a Christian creation is very strong in this group. Secondly, and I think this applies to most Americans today, because opinion polls continuously confirm the fact that Americans tend to regard themselves as conservative rather than liberal. Most Americans still believe in American exceptionalism. They think that when they sing the song "God Bless America," they believe it. And some of them may actually pray occasionally, and they probably pray for God to bless America. They believe we Americans still have some kind of spiritual role in the world, some kind of practical role, although they may not be very clear what that is. But basically, they still believe in American exceptionalism. Third, many Americans, not very religious, believe that the US did the right thing in opposing Hitler and Japanese militarism, and perhaps in containing Soviet communism so that ultimately democracy came to Europe or Eastern Europe and Russia at the end of the Cold War. But they are not very sure that things are moving in the right direction in this country. They certainly don't have the same kind of belief in America's spiritual role that others have. They're a lot more pluralistic in their attitudes. They may not be churchgoers, and if they are churchgoers, their theology may be kind of liberal and maybe a little wishy-washy. So they're people on the edge of a complete change of worldview. Their parents were probably American exceptionalists. Some of their friends may be, but their children almost certainly are not. And in the next generation, the children of this group of Americans will have a very different worldview unless the Holy Spirit is graceful enough to intervene and cause a great conversion. Finally, the fourth category are American secularists who believe that the belief in American exceptionalism is wrong, who believe that America was never a special nation, was never particularly Christian. America, they believe, was not called by God to be a nation. There is no absolute truth, they believe. God may exist, but there's certainly no plausible way to get to know him. And in fact, they also believe that Americans may have been the cause of many of the things that have gone wrong, not just in this country, but around the world. They think all values are relative. There is no good and evil. There are only beneficial and harmful acts that are demonstrated in various degrees. But it's the job of the government, not of individuals or the church, to decide which actions of people or groups are right and wrong, and how we should create remedies to prevent their happening in the future. It's a real mishmash of different viewpoints in this collection of worldviews of Americans that I've explained. But there are two main sources of influence on American worldviews that we really need to understand. The first, and I think the most important, is the world of entertainment media, the world of Hollywood and TV. There's a real reason for that. For some reason, creative people who are drawn to Hollywood tend to subscribe to the most extreme radicalism of worldviews that are experimental or progressive or liberal, and in general are very anti-Christian. That is why the movie critic, who is Jewish actually, Michael Medved, wrote a book several years ago called Hollywood versus America. And what he showed was that when people produce a movie which is family friendly, which promotes patriotism and charitable values and civic virtue, the movie almost invariably does well at the box office. People want to see those kind of movies. But Hollywood has consistently produced really vulgar, extreme, and totally anti-Christian and anti-religious movies because the script writers and some of the studios are so locked into this relativistic, radical individualistic view of the world that they are more desirous of seeing this idea being expressed in creative form than they are in making money. I mean, that doesn't make sense, but that seems to be the case. These people are very skillful, these Hollywood screenplay writers and so on. They're skillful at generating an emotional response in a consumer of the movie and generating an identification with the cause that they want to advance. They are active promoters of a worldview and very creative and very conscious about what they're trying to do. Beneath the title of this Hollywood creative worldview, you have the following suppositions. God probably doesn't exist, and there's no sure way of telling right from wrong. All values are relative. Human beings have rights as radical individuals to choose their own lifestyle without consideration of anyone else. Third, sexual relations are entirely, well, I guess this comes under the rubric of relativism, but relations in general are global in scale. And this goes to international relations. For example, America, they say, may be at fault for the values and ideas that she has demonstrated in recent times, and America is probably responsible for many of the things that have gone wrong. Many of the American implicit ideas, these people argue, are probably wrong, including the idea of freedom and the idea of democracy. It's very interesting. They had a fellow on TV, well, he wasn't a screenplay writer, at least I hope he wasn't, in coverage of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And he was saying, I'm a communist, and I think we should get rid of America. I mean, it's a very extreme point of view, but it's propagated in parts of the Hollywood universe. This point of view has also created the climate of political correctness, which makes it risky for people to express convictions about their faith or their views of other faiths that contradict the sort of political correct standard. I'll give you an example which I read in the Wall Street Journal this morning, actually. It's a very interesting story. In Paris, there is a satirical magazine called Charlie. I'd never heard of this, but Charlie's editorial offices were firebombed last week, and guess what? A group of identifiable Muslim, Turkish, well, I shouldn't say Muslim, Turkish Islamist activists claimed credit for it. And the reason they were so angry was that Charlie was going to produce a satirical edition. It was going to be called Sharia Week, and they had all kinds of sort of satirical comments about how Muslims should react, or how people should react to this Sharia week satirical edition. For example, they said, if you don't die of laughing, Muhammad is going to give you 100 lashes. That's a fairly provocative thing to say, but it's also quite funny if you accept the validity of satire. Now, very interesting thing happened. Okay, after it was known that this satirical edition of Charlie was going to come out, the place was firebombed, and then you began to get some very interesting reactions, not in the Islamic press, but in the American press. Let me give you one example. The Time magazine bureau chief of Time, the bureau chief of Time, criticized Charlie and criticized the proposal that they were going to write a satirical magazine about Sharia. And they said, I can get this quote right, they basically said, I'm going to paraphrase, that it was absolutely puerile and infantile, and it was a classic case of Islamophobia, and it sure begged these organizations to commit the very violence which they claim to be against. In other words, listen to that. This guy from Time magazine, I've never met him, fortunately, he says there is a phenomenon called Islamophobia, which is one of the worst sins that any individual can commit. And Islamophobia provokes people to terrorism. So therefore, you shouldn't commit Islamophobia. Now, it's curious to me, in the last few years of the Cold War, when Ronald Reagan was president, there was quite a lot of very sharp criticism of the Soviet Union, including by President Reagan and many other American officials. And I recall vividly that one of the columns by the then bureau chief of Time in Washington, Strobe Talbot, said, and President Reagan is particularly guilty of anti-Sovietism. Anti-Sovietism, what's that? Well, it falls into the same category of Islamophobia. There is this thing called Sovietism. It's one glorious thing, whatever it means. And then there is anti-Sovietism, which is a vicious disease indulged in by reactionaries from Orange County or something like that. The same thing about Islam. Islam is this great, colossal, divine religion which is so perfect, nobody should ever criticize it. And if anybody ever does, he's guilty of Islamophobia. So there is this, one of the things that this media worldview creates is a real doubt about the values of our own society, the values of political democracy in the West, the values of freedom, certainly the values of the beneficial role of the Christian faith in the virtues that our society has fostered and demonstrated. There was another very interesting article in the Wall Street Journal about two prominent writers who were good friends with each other, the American Dorothy Thompson and the British writer Rebecca West. They're both dead now. But in the 1930s, these writers were, well, Thompson particularly was the first American reporter to get an interview with Adolf Hitler in 1931, 2 years before he came to power. And she immediately said, this guy is evil and he's going to do terrible harm. Now, how did she know that? Well, partly it was discerning through Hitler's personality what he was really like, and partly it was going to see Hitler youth summer camps and hearing young German teenagers say, "Our duty is to die for Germany." That made her realize something was very serious in this phenomenon of the Nazis. Now, Rebecca West was a British novelist who wrote brilliantly about the British traitors who championed Nazi Germany during the war. One of them was the famous William Joyce, so-called Lord Haw-Haw, who used to broadcast from Berlin sort of propaganda diatribes to the British troops and so forth. Haw-Haw and another of the British traitors in the same category fortunately was captured at the end of the war and executed for treason. But Rebecca West wrote a very interesting explanation of why English society had become so vulnerable to the corrosion of the ideas of the Nazis. And basically she came to the conclusion that with the essential continuing disbelief in Christianity, people had become vulnerable to ideas of guilt with no redemption because Christianity had gone. And people therefore felt guilty that Britain and the Allies had been nasty to the Germans, and so perhaps the British should pay for that guilt by the success of totalitarian movements like the Nazis and later the communists that would provide solutions to these problems. So we've seen in this country how guilt has infected a great deal of the social movements, both of the 1960s era and of our own day. For example, in the Occupy Wall Street movement, you are seeing examples of the same thing, a feeling that because some people got rich off the housing bubble, and the housing bubble demonstrated a serious weakness in the whole process of mortgages and so forth, that capitalism itself must be completely wrong. In fact, if you look at the Occupy Wall Street movement, although I'm certainly not categorizing everybody as a nut or a lefty or anything else, there's surely some very reasonable middle-class people who've lost jobs or homes who are protesting at the maybe criminality, we don't know, of what went on to cause the housing bubble and its collapse. There are people at the edge of the movement who are advocating violence to create a sort of utopian correction of everything in our society. And that's very dangerous, and not surprisingly, Americans who were initially in favor of the Occupy Wall Street movement seem to be turning against it. How are we going to respond to these worldviews? How are we going to train people to know how to articulate their own views and to demonstrate the conviction that their worldviews are much more realistic and much more socially beneficial than these other ones? The first thing I think we have to do is to go back in history and say, how was the worldview of the United States first expressed? I mean, I'm talking about the worldview after English settlers started coming over. And if you look back at that, you find it was the worldview of Puritan Calvinism, which definitely believed in God's redemption. It believed in God's special plan for Americans. It believed in the fallenness of all human beings, the impossibility of living the perfect life or living even a good life without God's grace. And that view was really strongly held for about the first 200 years of American history since the beginning of the settlement in the 1620s and 30s. If you read de Tocqueville, who was writing in 1635, you find from his description of America that Americans still thought of themselves very much as a people with a special spiritual destiny, a special spiritual calling, and a special spiritual responsibility. That was certainly true for the first 200 years. And then what happens, you begin to see a breakdown. I'm not going to go into great detail because it would take too long, but you see the tendency of universities to cut themselves off from the churches with which they'd been previously linked, to open universities up to the doctrine that science alone was acceptable as a criterion for study, and then particular individual scientific theories that began to drive out of the university marketplace teachings like philosophy by Christian theologians and theology, and the basic presumption of naturalism as the way the world has come into being. That, of course, was articulated by Darwin, and Darwinism essentially conquered all of the universities in the United States and set in motion a whole series of views that shaped the worldview that has emerged among most Americans from this mishmash. Freudianism, Marxism, of course, Darwinism and the view of the worship of science. These things have all polluted the climate with which we look at the world and try to explain what is happening. So how do we counter this? Well, I agree very much with Andre that Christians have to be informed what they believe. It is quite ridiculous that up to 40% of Americans who call themselves Christians cannot name the first four Gospels. Well, there are only four, but cannot name the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They just don't know them. There are other polls that show the ignorance of the Bible, the ignorance of the basic positions of the Christian faith is hugely widespread. Now, why is that? Why have you got churches where pastors are allowing their congregations to slumber on in ignorance and are not pushing them to grasp the realities, the wonderful, life-changing realities of the Christian gospel? Second, I think we need, and you're part of this, intelligent lay people who understand that to combat the culture of this mishmash of worldviews, we need people with really solidly formed worldviews from a Christian perspective. You've got to know not only what you believe and why you believe it, but why that belief should change everything about your life and about the way life is explained. This is the real challenge. Transforming a sense that something is desperately missing in our culture into an urgent need, an urgent conviction that it's possible to change this. I think a lot of people here, as I have been praying for revival in this country, a turning back to God. And that's something we should certainly continue to pray for. But I think one of the parts of that revival, if and when it happens, I believe it will happen, is that the people who call themselves Christians will be able to make a very convincing case why other worldviews are just nonsense. They just don't explain successfully, effectively, why reality is the way it is. I spent most of my professional life as a journalist, and I was sometimes asked the reason for my hope. It's interesting that the Bible doesn't say the reason for my faith, it says the reason for my hope, the reason for the hope that I have in Christ. And I said, it's very simple. If you're a journalist, you get to see the moldy side of life. Journalism or news reporting is man bites dog. It's not dog bites man, because dog bites man everywhere. But when man bites dog, that is news. You see great people who fall because of personal vices or follies that they have engaged in at some time or other. And people who thought were going to be heroes of the day, who were going to solve all kinds of problems, turn out to have feet of clay. Journalists who are not Christians have the greatest difficulty explaining why the people they idealized and perhaps even idolized have fallen so short. But Christians, I always used to say, they are the only people who have a common sense explanation. Man is made in the image of God, but he is fallen, and that every human being, bar none, is capable of great lapses of virtue and wisdom and decency. And there, but for the grace of God, go all of us. If you can find a better explanation of why bad people do well and why evil crops up in different places, please give it to me. But I don't think you'll find it. I think the Christian explanation remains the best of all. And that's why I think we have a real priority to acquire an understanding of the Christian worldview and to articulate it in how we view life. Thank you.